It's a little loud, but okay. For those of you who know me over the 20 some years I've played around here, I periodically just get totally drawn into a topic. Okay, so while this doesn't quite perfectly fit in genealogy, it does in history, so why not? So, what we're going to do today is take an intimate look at Thomas Jefferson, the private person. Okay, we all know him as the public person. We're going to look at Sally Hemings, who in many ways is one of the most interesting and enigmatic of the 18th century slaves, okay, in this country. And then as we go through, we're going to end up talking a lot about the impact of slavery on the families of enslaved people, because that's really where this story goes. So let's start off by looking at the people that we're going to be talking about. John Wales was a slave trader. He made money by bringing slaves into the country and selling them, sometimes on consignment. Okay. He became a very successful planter. His oldest child by his first wife was Martha Epps Wales, and Martha was the woman who became Thomas Jefferson's wife. Okay, so we now have her pegged. She died shortly after Martha's birth, and he had two other wives, both of whom died fairly quickly. And so at that point, he started a long-term relationship with Elizabeth Hemings, Betty. Betty Hemings was the daughter in turn of a American ship captain and an enslaved woman coming out of Africa. Okay. And she had six children with John. They had a long-term relationship, the youngest of whom was Sally Hemings. And since Sally and Thomas Jefferson had the relationship we'll talk about, she was the half-sister, of course, to Martha. So Martha's children that lived to adulthood were two, Martha and Mary. And Sally had four children that lived to adulthood, William Beverly, Harriet, James Madison, and Thomas Eston. I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but these are the books that I really went through. These are plus some other research online. If anybody is really drawn into this topic, the book is The Hemingses of Monticello by Annette Gordon Reed. Professor Gordon Reed is a professor at the Harvard Law School who did in-depth precision research on this subject. Okay, she went through masses of letters to and from Jefferson, his diaries, a lot there. So let's talk a moment about the public Jefferson. He was elected to the House of Burgesses in 1768. You will see at that point he was 25. His first appearance on the national scene came with a pamphlet called A Summary View of the Rights of British America. And what that did was it was a introduction to what later became the Declaration of Independence. It covered much of the same ground, but it was a little pamphlet published in Virginia, and it got reprinted and sent throughout the colonies, and it's why he had a national reputation as being a superb writer. And the other things that he did were mostly well known. I'm always drawn to the Virginia Statute of Religious Freedom. Okay, on his tombstone, he only says three things he wants to be remembered for: the Declaration of Independence, the Statute of Religious Freedom, and the University of Virginia. The Statute of Religious Freedom is at the core of the American separation of church and state. Prior to its passage, every adult male in Virginia, whether they were Jewish, Quaker, Baptist, every adult male had to give a tithe to the state that was given in turn to the Church of England. So it was direct support by the government with everybody's money of a church. Okay, so if you think about it, that was really at the heart of the separation of church and state. Now, if there's anybody who's really into wordsmithing, okay, the people who supported Jefferson's position were disestablishmentarianism. Now, everybody who's at least my generation probably knows where I'm going to go. The people who wanted to keep the old system were the anti-disestablishmentarianists. When I was growing up, I was taught that was the longest word in the English language. A couple of quotes, and I apologize for this being cut off at the bottom. John Meacham, who you'll see sometimes on MSNBC if you watch it, but is a noted historian. Jefferson had a remarkable capacity to marshal ideas and move men to balance the inspirational with the pragmatic. Okay? If you'd asked Jefferson if he thought the President of the United States should make the Louisiana Purchase, he'd have said absolutely not. However, he did. Meacham also said he was a master emotional and political manipulator. Women in particular loved him. Gordon Reed's comment, which is cut off at the bottom, I'm sorry. His public attitude can be compared to his private life, which was always oriented to his personal comfort. Monticello was a self-contained patriarchal enclave, set apart from the hustle and bustle of the outside world. And the issue here was that certain truths had to be overridden or rationalized when they bumped up against an extreme self-interest that did not rest comfortably with the implications of those truths. All right, moving on. This is Martha Wales. She was, this is the only known picture of her. They married in 1772 and lived at Shadwell, which was Jefferson's boyhood home, at the foot of the mountain that's Monticello. If you've been to Monticello, you probably have run into Shadwell. In 1774, he had begun to clear the property at the top of the mountain to create the place that would become Monticello. And they moved up there. There was one building, 2 stories, 1 room, each story. So there was a common room in the bottom and a bedroom upstairs. Okay. Now, in 1773, which you may remember is the year that Sally Hemings was born, John Wales died. And so Martha inherited 135 slaves, including the entire Hemings family. And the Hemings family became the house servants in Monticello. He also died with a lot of debt. And there was a problem with that because there was no money. Therefore, Jefferson sold slaves, which is what you did. You sold assets in order to pay debts, right? Martha had 5 children. 3 lived beyond infancy. Martha, Mary, who's also called Polly, and Lucy. She was ill after each pregnancy and died after the last child was born in 1748. Family tradition says that Betty and Sally were both in the room when she died. It is said when she came to the children, she wept and could not speak for some time. Finally, she held up her hand and, spreading out her fingers, she told Jefferson she could not die happy if she thought her children were ever to have a stepmother brought over them. Holding her hand, Jefferson promised he would never remarry, and he never did. And according to the Hemings family tradition, during her final hours, Martha gave her youngest sister, half-sister, Sally, A handbell as a memento. The young girl, perhaps called by that very bell, had run errands for her older sister. The story of this somewhat ambiguous keepsake highlights with clarity the complexity of slavery in the South. Here is a sister making a present on her deathbed to her sister, who's her slave. This was the first Monticello. Okay. Jefferson built a fairly conventional manor. He built the one we both all know when he returned from France. We do not have a picture of Sally. However, we have two contemporaneous descriptions of her, one from her son Madison and one from one of Jefferson's grandsons on Martha's side. Sally was mighty near white, very handsome, long straight hair down her back, light colored and good looking. Well, let's start off with the fact she was only 1/4 African American. Okay. Betty was half white. Okay. And she was the child of Betty and John Wales. So it's logical she was 1/4 white. The Hemings family moved to Monticello about the same time Jefferson and Martha moved there. They all lived in slave cabins. The typical slave cabin was about 10 by 10. The Hemings family were always house slaves. They never had to work in fields. In most enslaved communities, all of the slaves, women, children, everybody, went out into the fields during the critical periods like harvesting. As a young slave, Sally would have learned how to keep house, sew, and help with other chores as needed. From the age of 6, she was a lady's maid to Jefferson's daughter, Mary. Typical duties of a lady's maid would be she would help her mistress when she woke up in the morning. She would bring her breakfast in bed. She would help her with her appearance, with her makeup, with her hairdressing, with her clothing, her jewelry, shoes. She would remove stains from clothing, sew, mend, and alter garments. She would draw her mistress's bath. She would stay up until her mistress was settled in for the night, when she would finally go to her own quarters. As a young child, she was probably there when Colonel Tarleton and his troops, you know, Peggy, could you catch the light over there? There's one of the alternatives says PowerPoint, and it will dim the lights in the room. Uh, uh, Colonel Tarleton was sent by Cornwallis to capture Jefferson. Jefferson at the time was the governor of Virginia. Jefferson at the last minute was warned, jumped on his horse, and escaped. Martin Hemings, who was one of Sally's brothers, was then Jefferson's butler. And the family story is that he was approached by a soldier who pointed a gun at him and said, "Where is Jefferson?" And he said he would not tell him. The soldier said, "I will shoot you." Martin apparently said, "Then shoot." Now, let's look at a moment at Jefferson as a slave owner. Now, in looking at these numbers, you might consider that the value of a slave was about $300 in currency then. The general multiplier we're going to use for currency compared to today is 20. So that's about $6,000 of value today. He was the second largest slaveholder in Albemarle County. He owned the most slaves of any president, noting George Washington actually had more slaves in his control, but the majority of his slaves were held in trust for Martha's children, the Custis children. And those he owned, Washington freed in his will. I think the next thing is what I tend to call Sally's coming of age. In 1784, Jefferson accepted the position of ambassador to France. He took his older daughter, Martha, who was nicknamed Patsy, and James Hemings, another one of Sally's brothers. He put Patsy in a convent school near Paris and had James trained as a French chef. I mean, that was one of Jefferson's dreams, was to bring a French chef back to Monticello. He left his other daughters, Polly and at that time Lucy, who would have been about 2, with his wife's sister Elizabeth, who was married to Francis Epps, and they stayed at Eppington. This is the family plantation for the Epps, and Sally would have come with him to serve as a maidservant. Lucy, however, died of whooping cough soon after. And Jefferson at that point just freaked out. He said, I have to have Polly here. I can't have her separated from me. So he sent for Polly to be brought to France, accompanied by one of the older female slaves. However, at the last minute, it was discovered that that slave was pregnant. So instead, Sally Hemings, age 14, was sent as the companion with Polly to France. So in 1787, Polly and Sally left Norfolk and sailed to London aboard the ship Arundel under the care of the vessel's captain. Polly had her own stateroom and ate with the captain. We know that from her records. Sally probably slept near her and ate with the cabin boy, which would have been common at the time. So they docked in London. And who was the ambassador to London at the time? John Adams. So they were met by John and Abigail. Abigail was somewhat concerned about Sally. So there are a couple of letters from Abigail that are in the record. The girl who is with her is quite a child, and the captain is of the opinion she will be of so little service that they had better carry her back. But of this you be a judge. She seems fond of the child and appears good-natured. The girl Polly has with her more wants, and there's more care than the child, and is wholly incapable of looking properly after her, without some superior to direct her. As both of them had clothes only proper for the sea, I have purchased and made up for them such things as I would have done had it been my own. Gordon Reed wonders out loud, as I would, whether Abigail anticipated the relationship that was going to emerge here. I should comment, Abigail and John were well known to be anti-slavery, but that should not be confused with whether they were racist. Abigail Adams wrote at one point, after seeing the play Othello, the sooty appearance of the Moor, I could not separate the African color from the man, nor prevent the disgust and horror which filled my mind every time I saw him touch the gentle Desdemona. That's Abigail. So Sally and Polly arrived in Paris in July 1787. This must have been amazing. Paris at the time had 700,000 people. It had palaces, it had parks, museums. New York and Philadelphia each had about 50,000. But if you had been Polly and Sally, the largest city you would have seen would probably have been Williamsburg, which had 2,000 people. So you can imagine. Jefferson put Polly in the convent school with Patsy, and while they visited him frequently, most of the time, the only people in the residence were Jefferson, James Hemings, Sally, and William Short, who was Jefferson's private secretary. Sally had to go to a clinic to get a smallpox vaccination, which required a 7-week quarantine. Okay. You were not allowed to remain in Paris unless you had proof of being inoculated. The family that ran the clinic, it was just outside Paris, and they treated the most powerful people in France, and it was quite expensive. Jefferson had a substantial residence. On the right there, the Hotel de Langeac, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that, was built for a royal mistress. It had 24 rooms. It was here that Hemings began to act in what would be her roles as an adult in Monticello. Chambermaid Jefferson, a seamstress doing light sewing for the household, and helping out Patsy and Polly as they needed. Since her brother had been in Paris for 2 years, it's quite probable that he took her out to see the sights of this large and fabulous city. One of their guests was John Trumbull. He did this painting of the signing of the Declaration of Independence there, with Jefferson as his guide. He also did this portrait of Jefferson. So this is what Jefferson probably looked like about the time he and Hemings began their relationship. Sally would have arrived wearing something like this dress. Americans, but particularly Jefferson, were big on homespun, meaning made from cloth in the United States. Okay, so you didn't have to import things from Europe. This would have been French fashion. So Jefferson took her out and bought her new clothing. He said she needed good clothes to accompany his daughters if they went to a ball or something. He spent in today's terms, about $1,000 buying her clothing. He also paid her a regular allowance. So, I want to divert here into a look at what it meant to be a woman in the 18th century and much of the 19th century. Women were subject to being what's called a femme cavere, which meant that when they got married, they lost all independence from their husband under the law. So the result was that women looked for a relationship with the man who could be the greatest protector, the wisest advisor, the most thoughtful rulemaker. When Jefferson had last seen Sally, she would have been 11. Now she was almost a grown woman, and it's certainly believed she looked like Martha, his wife. And somewhere in this period, they began their long-term relationship. She became pregnant with her first child with Thomas in 1789. It is useful to note, by the way, that under the laws, a female slave could not refuse her master's insistence that they have sex. However, 16-year-old Sally Hemings was sort of in a perfect position to understand where she was. Okay? Consider that her mother had that long-term relationship with John Wales. Okay? And consider Meacham's comment that Jefferson could enchant almost anybody. She had never known a father. John Wales died essentially the year she was born. So Jefferson also represented a father figure. I would even wonder whether her mother had mentioned to her the possibility that such a relationship might be possible. In addition, while she was 16, women were considered to be able to consent to a sexual relationship when they were 10 at that time, and women of 15 were considered of marriageable age. So Jefferson decided to return to America. Actually, he was sort of called back. 1789, he was going to be given the position of Secretary of State in the first administration. But Sally and James had an option. At that time, slaves were not legal in France. So all they had to do was to get a lawyer, go to a judge, and they would have been declared free in France. Obviously, that would not have applied had they returned to America. Jefferson wanted them both back, so he sought their agreement. And Sally and Jefferson reached an agreement which he honored, and that is that their children would be freed. On that basis, she agreed to return to America. Jefferson offered her a life as companion to a wealthy and powerful man whom she knew well, and he said, could trust, that he would do what he promised, take care of her in a place she felt comfortable, provide something she much desired for her children, freedom, a stable relationship with an acceptable man. Let's go back to all women at that time, pretty much stuck in that same situation. Hemings could have envisioned a good life, and Jefferson, you had to look at the kind of life she could have lived. She couldn't have married Jefferson. The miscegnation laws were absolutely clear on that matter. And for that matter of fact, she could not have married an African American because slaves were not allowed to marry. So what was her option? And when we get to the end, I'm going to ask those of you who are here to think about what you would have done in that circumstance. In a separate comment, James Hemings agreed to go back. The deal he worked with Jefferson was Jefferson would free him when he had trained another member of the household, another slave, to be a French chef. And Jefferson did. Technically in 1782, a person who was an octoroon, 1/8 black or less, was classified as white. Now that changed in the 1800s. As with many things, the 18th century was a lot easier on certain aspects of slavery than the first half of the 19th century. But ultimately, 3 of Sally's 4 adult children did become white. And the problem for Sally technically was the law was quite clear. The children of a slave woman were going to be slaves. Didn't matter how much or how little of each of the blood they had. So while they were there for the storming of the Bastille. Patsy Jefferson recalled seeing 60,000 citizens, flourishing swords, scythes, and pruning hooks, march in the streets of Paris. And after the storming of the Bastille, Jefferson hosted a group of people led by Lafayette to discuss the possibility of a constitution for France. However, we now return to Virginia and Monticello, now no neighborhood full of well-appointed homes, no balls to attend. And now what they would have would in fact be the slave cabins we saw earlier. Okay. When they returned, one of Jefferson's top priorities was his imagined redesign of Monticello itself. And that's when they began construction of his building. This is a room that they have declared to have been where Sally Hemings lived. It's 8x14 is in the south wing of the main building near the kitchen. As an aside, Sally's bed was among the items Jefferson had shipped back to Virginia from Paris. The room was rediscovered by archaeologists following information given by Jefferson's oldest grandson and by Madison Hemings. The room had been turned into a men's bathroom. Her major responsibilities after return was caring for Jefferson's private quarters. She was well suited to perform the personal services, being a familiar, telling him what he needed to hear about what happened, having sex, attending to his needs, being a person of his private world. They lived for 20 years after the birth of their last child. Perhaps they shared their older years the way many of us do, sitting around, talking, perhaps in French, which they both could understand, discussing their children. These were the children. We'll talk about each of them in turn. And then she had 3 children who died in infancy. Those numbers are fairly common, about a little more than half living to adulthood. The biggest challenge to their well-being was when James Callender, a noted muckraker, published an article outing her. Jefferson simply did not respond, and the accusations continued for the rest of his life. John Quincy Adams even wrote a poem about Dusky Sally. The pride of Jefferson's workshops was his woodworking shop. This is a laptop desk. John Hemings, who was a half brother to Sally, ran the woodworking shop. All three of his sons by Sally were trained as woodworkers. It was a very profitable occupation for a tradesman. William Beverly was the eldest child. He was born in 1798, 8 months and 3 weeks after a visit by Jefferson to Monticello. In 1961, Winthrop Jordan, a researcher, showed from historic notes that all of Sally's children were born after a visit by Jefferson to Monticello. Beverly Hemings had the name of the man who had helped open the West to Virginians, William Beverly. And Beverly had commissioned Jefferson's father, Peter, to create a map of the frontier. That's a somewhat hazy copy of it. Opening the West was Jefferson's great obsession. So Beverly grew up passing through the foyer where his grandfather's map was prominently displayed, memorializing both his name and his grandfather's work. In 1822, at the age of 23, he left for Washington. He was not formally freed, but he was not pursued. According to his brother Madison, who wrote a memoir that was completely ignored by all the historians until finally they realized that it was an accurate story of the family. According to his memoir, he passed as white after he moved, married a white woman of good standing, and they had a child. There's no definitive genealogy of Beverly's descendants. Harriet was the only one of Sally's daughters who lived to be an adult. She was born in 1801. Harriet was a family name from Jefferson's Randolph ancestors. She was taught to be a seamstress, an important skill for all women, white or slave. A few months after Beverly left, Harriet followed him. She was given about $50 by the overseer who paid for her transportation to Philadelphia. And again, she passed as white after she left. She married as white. Madison refused to give her married name for her protection. And again, we have no definitive genealogy of her family. 1824, Lafayette came to visit. And one of his primary stops was at Monticello, where he almost certainly would have looked for Sally, who he had known in Paris. And the final thing that Jefferson built was the University of Virginia, which he contributed heavily to. So, as is well known, Jefferson died July 4th, 1826, on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence. John Adams died the same day. As Jefferson faded, his grandson said he would only have his servants sleep near him, who were almost certainly Burwell Colbert, his valet, and Sally, the only two people known to have been allowed into his private quarters. He had trouble sleeping, and he did not want to be alone. And so his enslaved caregivers brought pallets in and slept on the floor overnight with him. He's buried in the Jefferson family plot in Monticello. The plot is owned by the Monticello Foundation, a private nonprofit, and it's not part of the Thomas Jefferson Foundation that owns the main property at Monticello. Jefferson's descendants by Martha and Mary are eligible to be buried there. Those by Sally are not. This is a cutting from his will. He freed 5 men in his will: his valet, his woodworker, John Hemings, and his blacksmith, Joseph Fawcett. They were all older men who had given him great service. In a fascinating twist, and why anybody could have ignored this over the years, in declaring that Sally's sons were not Jefferson's. He listed the two younger sons, Madison and Eston, okay, and said they are going to work for John um, John Hemings, until they reach the age of 21, and then they can be freed. But his excuse for letting them be freed was they were useful to John. So, in January 1827, the Charlottesville community made its way to Monticello for the estate sale. Announced in newspaper advertisements, the sale consisted of furniture, kitchenwares, farm equipment, livestock, curious and useful articles, and 130 valuable Negroes. Monticello was then abandoned. It was sold 5 years after he died. It had been deserted for quite some time. 3 years later, it was bought by Uriah Levy, a wealthy naval officer who revered Jefferson. His nephew, Jefferson Levy, inherited the house from Uriah, and he restored it and opened it to the public. The federal government refused to buy it, so in 1923, he sold it to the Thomas Jefferson Memorial Foundation, which runs it today. And our little tidbit of genealogy. Sally was what they called given her time by Martha Jefferson Randolph. This was the term used when a slave was informally freed. Under Virginia law, for logical reasons, if an older slave was freed, they had to leave the state. And the logical reason was the fear that if that wasn't the rule, that slave owners would just wait until their slaves were old, free them, and then they would become wards of the state. The state would have to take care of them. Madison and Eston rented property in Charlottesville. Sally lived with them until her death in 1835. This is interesting. If you can find Eston on there, you'll find that he and Sally are listed as white. Separately, Madison is listed as a free black. When she died, Sally was probably buried in the slave cemetery at Monticello. This has recently been restored after it had been covered over as a parking lot for many years. There are, of course, no grave markers. So this is the start of Madison's autobiography. After his mother died, he moved to Ohio. He worked as a farmer and a skilled carpenter. They had 10 children. That include 2 sons who served in the Union Army, one in the colored troops, and one as a white man. And this is his grandson, Frederick Madison Robert. Robert was a Los Angeles businessman who was the first African American elected to the California legislature. He served 8 terms and is credited with passing the bill that created UCLA. Eston also went to Ohio with his brother. However, in 1852, when the Dred Scott decision came down, he was terrified that his family would be subject to possible kidnapping by slavers. So he moved the family to Madison, Wisconsin, changed their name to Jefferson, and essentially declared they were white. The youngest, he seems to have been the one of all Jefferson's children who was the nearest copy of Jefferson physically and in terms of things he liked to do. He was a musician, played the violin, as Jefferson did. And in fact, he made quite a good living, not only as a woodworker, but also as a band leader. It is his line that found the DNA match with Jefferson. So this is John Wales Jefferson, note Wales in the name. He was Jefferson's grandson. He was born just before Sally Hemings died, raised and lived as white. fought and wounded at Vicksburg, and a colonel in the 8th Wisconsin Infantry Regiment. And not to forget the other part of Jefferson's lineage, John Wythe Randolph was Secretary of War in the Jefferson Davis cabinet for the Confederacy. Now, there's more to the story here, and I don't want to take too much time, but I do want to hit the highlights, because to some extent, what we've talked about so far is almost like a general story of, isn't it nice that there was this family and these people did well and all the rest. Gordon Reed's comment: slavery provided families in the South with ways to be bizarre. Fathers owned sons. Brothers gave away brothers as wedding gifts. Sisters sold their aunts. This was the horrific side of slavery. That's why Southern whites of the time worked so hard so no one would know it. The issue was that certain truths had to be overridden when they bumped up against self-interest. White supremacy does not demand conviction. It is ruthless self-interest that is the heart of white supremacy. The determination to state, live by, and act on the basis of ideas one knows are untrue. When doing so will yield benefits and privileges one does not care to relinquish. This is a weaver of the time, Nancy Hemings, and her 2 children were given away as a marriage gift by Jefferson to his sister. Her husband, he didn't really felt they needed them, so he wanted to sell them. His sister called Jefferson and said, she's a good weaver, and maybe you want to look at whether you want to set up a little manufacturing operation. Okay, so he in his notes noted she was 34 years of age and had ceased to breed. That's from his notes. She asked Jefferson to purchase her family. He flatly refused to buy Billy, who was 15, but said he was willing to buy Critta, age 12. Billy was lost to our history. In 1800, Thomas Bell, a white merchant in Charlottesville, died. His common-law wife was Mary Hemings, Sally's sister. She had 4 children before being hired out to Bell, and then 2 children with Bell. He willed his property to Mary and her son Robert, but he did not buy the older children. Mary was able to buy some of her children in that slave auction we talked about, but some were sold and lost to her. Colbert was Jefferson's valet. They had 5 daughters. She had died by the time Jefferson died, but they were all living. He was one of those 5 people freed. He was granted $300 at that time. That would be like $6,000 today, to purchase tools so he could continue his trade. But because she had belonged to Martha Jefferson, okay, his daughters remained in slavery as part of her household. Fawcett was the blacksmith, and he also was freed in the will, but his wife and 8 children were sold at the auction. Records suggest that he worked steadily at his trade to purchase the freedom of his wife and as many children as possible. The remainder of the children were sold to different slaveholders, and there is a story that some of his friends in Charlottesville bought members of the family, and then he bought them back as he had more money. After 23 years, he was able to have purchased all of his children back. Now let's return to the estate sale. The sale was a result of a lifetime where Jefferson always spent money to keep his standard of living where he wanted it. He had great wines. He bought books whenever he wanted. He bought 2 violins, one of which was reported to be an Amati, although not ever verified. He was a lavish entertainer. They said when he ate alone in Monticello, they would only serve 8 courses. but if he had guests, they would serve 20. Okay. And he would pick up debts of others. In addition to what happened to the slaves, there was nothing left for his daughters either. But of course, the impact on the slave families was devastating. They were sold and dispersed. No matter how close the Hemingses were to Jefferson, no matter how he viewed some of them, their family remained a commodity that could be sold or exchanged at will. That was what slavery meant for those who were enslaved. What would you have done in 1789 if you were Sally? Okay, so that's talk. I'll take questions, and if you're online, you're allowed to unmute yourself and ask a question if you want to. No questions? Okay. Can we use the mic? Just pass it over to him. My foot's. Oh, there's an off on button.
Okay, it's green. When I visited Monticello on a vacation, the tour guide was saying that Jefferson was really into plants, farming, gardening, studying plants. But did you come across that same kind
Absolutely.
of information?
He kept a daily diary, and that diary had everything from, okay, the daffodils are beginning to bloom, or the buds are on the tree, through to uh, Sally had a baby today. Okay, I mean, it's a little bit of everything, but very big on gardening and natural things. Very big. Okay, does anybody want to volunteer that they would, in the circumstance she was in, have said no, have stayed in France? Okay, we have a comment. Pass the mic.
I would have done what she did because he was basically probably very good to her. She knew him very well. She knew she'd be taken care of, you know. And in France, who did she know? I mean, that would have been very difficult probably for her to think about.
You have a good point in a lot of ways because it's not clear what would have happened in France. But at that time, in that 700,000 people, there were about 2,000 that were black. Okay. Most of whom simply served as servants in wealthy households. Any other thoughts or comments? Yeah, I think it's so difficult today because we do not have an easy way of looking back at what it meant to live in that world of femme covert, okay, where in fact you literally had no legal rights as a married woman, okay, as a married woman. And and in my genealogy, there's a famous case of a woman whose husband died and willed to her 600 of the best acres on the Cumberland River. And she waited 20 years until her youngest son was old enough and she dispersed the property. And then she remarried. But she wasn't remarrying earlier. But think about Martha Custis, Martha Dandridge Custis. Okay. when her husband died, first husband, she became one of the wealthiest people in the colonies. She had hundreds of slaves, lots of property, and she ran those plantations quite successfully for 3 years. Then the day after she married George Washington, had one of her children wanted to get married and be underage, he was the only one who could have said yes or no. And he, if he wished, could have sold any of the slaves or done any of the property. I mean, he had complete control. She had none. Of course, if you've ever read about Martha Washington, you wouldn't believe that for a minute, but legally, none. Okay, next month, what we're going to do is back to good old genealogy. We're going to do an introduction to how you might think about starting your genealogy. What are the sort of 4 or 5 things that really strike me as the things you might want to be thinking about as you begin your genealogical research? And I'll tell you the number 1 thing, which is, and then we can leave it from there. Anybody you research was a real person. And one of the objectives I've always had in genealogy is to understand the lives of the people that I'm researching. Not just born this day, married that day, you know, but what was going on in their lives? What was happening? Okay. My wife and I often have looked at this with her grandmother, who at age 19 left northwestern Poland to end up in Providence, Rhode Island. And you sort of say that there's a whole story there. Okay. And we've done enough research, we could write a book about the story, but it's not the facts, it's the story. Okay. We'll talk about that next time. The question was, how did you get the information? Okay. Do we have a last?
Wait.
It'll be on the website. Yeah. It gets on the website about 3 days after we have the meeting. Okay. Thank you all.
Thank you.